Hare Krishna. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyate Deshatarine. Hare Krishna. I'd like to welcome everyone today for a discussion on reading Srila Prabhupada's books. Today is a special day. It's a privilege for us to invite a very dear disciple of Srila Prabhupada to our conversation today. That is Her Grace Malati Devi Dasi. Malati Mataji is a GBC member for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and one of the first few devotees who took shelter of Srila Prabhupada at the very beginning of this movement. I'd like to welcome Malati Mataji. Hare Krishna.
Malati Devi Dasi. Hare Krishna.
Malati Devi Dasi. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavibhyo namaha. Thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to speak to you today on a topic that we are trying to unpack for the devotees in ISKCON.
Yeah.
You've been with this movement for probably as long as anybody can be with this movement. And we wanted to ask you, what was your first encounter with Srila Prabhupada's books?
Hare Krishna. Well, the first encounter with Srila Prabhupada's book, first Canto Bhagavatam in 3 parts, occurred in the end of September in 1966 on the top of an extremely tall mountain, about 6,000 feet. We were on the top of that. And there were 3 individuals, 2 of which, well, they'd all met Srila Prabhupada, but 2 of those individuals had become initiated by His Divine Grace in the first initiation that took place in Janmashtami of 66. The 3rd individual eventually, shortly thereafter, became initiated. But those 2 individuals were Mukunda and Janaki. And myself and my boyfriend were on the top of a mountain. He had a job, and that was looking for forest fires. And these people were very good friends. Sam had gone to school with Mike, who later became Mukunda. Sam became Shamsundar. And Jan and Joan, 2 sisters. Jan became Janaki, and eventually Joan became Jamuna. And it was all kind of interesting in that we had been in Portland, Oregon, which is on the west coast above California. And Mike and Jan went to New York City to try to seek their fortune, his fortune. Mike was an accomplished jazz pianist. And as soon as they got there, little letters would go back and forth. And then one little letter came, and he mentioned they had met a Swami. And right away, Sam, my boyfriend, he was totally into having a guru. He kept mentioning this, that we needed to have a guru. And my attitude was the typical stupid American woman, like, I don't want anyone telling me what to do with my life. I want to make my own mistakes. So that was my attitude. And we had met enough so-called gurus, we'd met them, so-called swamis. So there was some justification for that attitude, because these people were, just to give one quick example, one so-called guru, he had his disciples buy a pig farm. I mean, what is that, and get a great big huge snake, a really big one, which they had to feed live rats. And
Oh God.
seriously not attractive. So, I had that little attitude, but it was prompted by the experience, right? So the thing was, and okay, they met a Swami. Next letter was really surprising. They were going to get married. And honestly speaking, that wasn't part of our lifestyle in those days. You can
Yes.
say we were members of the hippie sampradaya, and
Yes.
we didn't believe in that. So that was quite surprising. And I also want to say that, Mukunda was not really one of the trashed out, burned out, drug taking hippies. He was
Mm,
always a very thoughtful person, but he could
mm,
be, he knew how to have fun when he wanted to. And
mm,
but he was a musician.
mm.
And
And were you both of you were still on the West Coast when you were receiving these letters from them?
yeah, we were up on the top of this mountain looking for forest
Oh,
fires.
it's quite
So then,
allegorical, your first meeting is almost allegorical to this song that we sing every morning, Samsara Dava Nalanida Loka. You're
yes,
looking
yes,
for a forest fire in a forest fire and you find something. You mentioned
yes.
that these books, how were the books placed
Well,
there? How did they arrive?
then what happened?
Hmm.
We get the letter, they're gonna get married, and we're like, snaps. So Joan went out to help her sister with the marriage.
Yes.
And then after the marriage, they all drove back to the West Coast. And we didn't know they were coming back. And we'd had a day off um, from our mountain. It was a no fire day, I guess. So where to go, because there wasn't really any place to go. This was a vast, vast wilderness. So we just went to another mountain. There were three mountains. They were called the Three Sisters, and we were on the
Hmm.
tallest one. So we went to the less tall mountain. And when we came back after our day off, we saw an automobile with New York license plates. And we were living in a small, very simple living, uh, no electricity, no running. Well, there was running water. You walked outside, you went over to a stream. That was the running water. And for all other personal, you went outside and did what you had to do. And if you wanted a hot bath, you brought water inside, and there was a wood stove to heat things up. So we walked in and we were really happily surprised to see our friends. And they'd already made themselves at home. And Janaki had some dough. She was rolling it into balls and then flattening it out and putting it on the wood fire stove, and it would puff up. And it was really fascinating. And so in addition to the introduction to the books, it was the first introduction to Krishna Prasadam, by the way. So, usually you greet and meet a guest, but the guests had already kind of like made themselves at home. So we wanted to offer them something like, something valuable. So we offered them, would you like some LSD? And they said no. So what's going on here? That,
Mhm.
new, they got married, they got new names, no LSD. And oh, by the way, they're vegetarians, which was fine. But that in the 60s, vegetarians were kind of considered by regular society to be next door to being communist. It wasn't mainstream at all. So when we were having this meal, Mukunda said, after dinner, I want to show you something. I want to show you the Swami's books. And that was the introduction. And it was really compelling because one of the things about the hippies, in spite of all the other like kind of nonsense activities, were like they were really seeking. They wanted to know the truth, but no clue how to find it, what it would look like. And the topic of God was like, well, very we're all God, you're God, I'm God, there's no God. There was a famous magazine cover by Time magazine on that year, a black cover with red "God is dead."
Oh,
So it was, nobody knew what to think. And for myself, I had had enough from an early age. I understood I was not this body from very early age. I knew it, but I didn't know what I was. And I would ask my mother, and she would just, don't ask these questions. I went to church, don't ask these questions.
was there any experience in your early age
Yes,
which made you feel like
yes.
that? Would you be able to share that with us?
Um, well, there were several, there were several. Out of going out of the body and seeing myself, that happened.
Oh,
And but I'm young. I'm not even 10 years old. I mean, I knew this from an early time. And anyway, that kind of thing was going on, but I didn't know who who I was. And then I'd had other experiences which assured me there was something, someone, something greater than I was. But what was it? I didn't know. So in the I was trying to find an image of the first, those first books, but I couldn't find one. They've changed the cover. But on the original cover, there was in the center, and this is what I was looking at, a blue man with four arms lying on a snake with a flower stem coming out of his navel. And on top of that flower, there was another fellow with four heads. And I'm looking at this, and he was also blue. So what is this? And I go, who is this? And Mukunda said in a very sober way, this is God. And I immediately was like, accepted that. Because here, God couldn't be like us. If I was God, the world was doomed. And from the Christians, they would say man is made in the image of God. But what image? And, he had to be different from us. He couldn't just be like us. So here was an extraordinary personality, like us, but not like us. And this was God. So then when I opened up this book, and, they were in 3 volumes. So I opened up and I'm seeing the Sanskrit, I'm seeing the transliteration, the translation, and those purports. And I mean, it's like some people when they first come to the temple, they can't even fix their eye, it's so bewildering. I've had people like Ravinda Sru told me he didn't even notice Devi's the first time he went in, and you're just so much. So this book was just so much. I'm looking, it's not that I could actually even read anything right away, but I'm seeing um, certain words come out, certain phrases. But the one that was capturing me was the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Person, the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
wow.
And that was it. God is a person. But it was just so astounding that I actually, at that moment, wanted to meet the Swami.
But quite a powerful experience for the first
Yeah,
time. I mean, there's few devotees that we've spoken to, they mentioned that they met a devotee on the street, they saw the book, which in itself is quite powerful, depending upon the encounter. But in this
yeah,
case, it seems that many elements of Krishna consciousness, be it the culture, be it the prasad, be it the devotees, be it the transcendental literature, all converged on that day
yes.
uh, amongst you friends to give this very powerful experience. And
And a convincing experience. Because Mukunda wasn't preaching to us. He said, I just want to show you these books. But of course, the preaching was in the actions, just like the prasadam was. The whole thing was so perfectly orchestrated that I wanted to meet this Swami.
we often hear from devotees, they say that the book by itself is a very, very powerful entity to bring somebody to Krishna consciousness.
Yes.
But we don't come across such a powerful experience that you shared, where immediately all of you were absorbed. May I ask that, let's say, the other friends who were around on that occasion, were they also feeling something similar like you were, or
No,
was
it
this an
was the only
exception?
people there was myself and who became Shamsundar, um, Janaki Mukunda, and Joan, who became Jamuna. That's
Okay.
it. I mean, we were in extreme isolation. Actually, it would have been perfect
Yes.
for COVID. Nobody went there. Nobody went there. It was like these zigzag roads of dirt on the side of the mountain, and there was only one vehicle could actually, you know, pass by. So
Did you ever ask Mukunda and his wife as to what inspired them to come back? Were they
oh
really
yeah.
come there to preach to you
No,
indirectly,
no, they
let you
no,
know?
they were on a mission. They had already wanted to go to India.
Ah,
So if you've read Miracle on 26 Avenue, that's this, it's quite well explained. But they had wanted to go to India, so they were coming back to the West Coast, um, which was where they were from. And then Prabhupada said, "Well, perhaps you can start something there before you go." He didn't tell them not to go.
hmm,
Perhaps you can start. And then Mukunda had this epiphany, like he's got, he realized he'd been given some great benediction and he should do something for him. And
hmm.
so he agreed. Okay. So when he then after showing the book and discussing it, so we're going to San Francisco to start a temple. And then I asked a very profound question. My profound question was, what's a temple? And Mukunda said
Yes.
he said it's a storefront painted white.
Mhm.
And that's what we did.
That's even more profound an answer than the question I was saying.
Well, it was pretty accurate for the day.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so then he said, why don't we go with him?
Hmm.
The thing was, we were up there on a contract, and the contract said we had to stay there till the first snowfall, because the fire season would be finished, right? So he
Yes.
said, yeah, as soon as the snow falls, we'll certainly come down. Well, the next morning I woke up and call of nature. So I opened the door to go outside and there was snow. It wasn't huge deep, but there was snow. And then not only that, there was a mountain lion footprint right in front of our doorstep. Well, you can see the footprint of the mountain lion. So then I got pretty excited and we had this kind of two-way radio thing, crank it up and go to the station, the ranger station down below. And I said, we're going to leave. And he goes, what do you mean you're going to leave? I said,
Hmm.
it snowed. We're going to leave,
The
you know.
contract is over.
And he says, well, it didn't snow down here, which at that time I didn't understand that it's quite normal sometimes at a higher elevation, there'll be snow. I live in a hillside here in New Vrindavan. Temple's just 3 minutes at a good clip down the side. I mean, it's not hugely elevated, but sometimes it'll be snow up where in my place, I go down there and it's not happening. But I didn't know that at the time. So when he goes, well, it didn't snow down here. I said, well, it snowed up here. And then he goes, well, it's not going to stay. And I looked at the contract and I said, well, it doesn't say it has to stay.
Hmm.
So so we kind of got things together. It took a day or
On
so
the
because
first evening, before we move on the first evening when this word Supreme Personality of Godhead sort of really appealed to you and you flipped through the book, did you discuss anything with Mukunda Maharaj or his wife at all? Or
no,
you just were happy to absorb yourself in the
no,
book?
just I don't remember any direct conversation in that respect at all.
Oh,
Um, I mean, this was just like a few September, October, November, September. I mean, they had just gotten initiated. Like, this was like pretty new even to them,
yes.
you know?
But yet it was a very, very subtle and a very inspiring something that connected immediately with you.
Yes, yes.
Wow. Wow. Did you keep the books with you, or did they take it
Well,
with them?
those were Mukunda's books.
Right.
He
So
didn't have extra.
they left with
Well,
him.
no, we left. We went too. We, I took the horses. I had borrowed a couple of horses and some chickens. I took them back to the rancher,
Yes.
and packed our stuff. We had a what they called a station wagon in those days, like before there was SUVs, there were station wagons. So we
Hmm.
had that. We had a little trailer to pull it along, and we put everything in there. We had one dog and one cat that came with us.
Hmm.
That little dog's name was Ralphie, and you can see him if you Google San Francisco 67 January Prabhupada's arrival, and you'll see he
Yes.
came to the airport also. You see him wagging his little tail. There was quite a few interactions with Prabhupada and that little dog, actually.
So once you moved to San Francisco, and there, between the first time when you looked at the book, do you recall when did you actually get to read or talk about the book at all with the other devotees?
Actually, because we got in the mode of looking for a temple, and we
Yes.
had been in San Francisco. We had friends there who were in the music business, and we tried to get them interested because we would need some support, and we
Yes.
figured they, could be helpful. So it was pretty much in the mode of getting ready for
Yes.
Prabhupada to
Actually.
come.
Yes.
And he came in January of '67. That was quite wonderful, and we were initiated just like literally immediately. But we had already, because we knew he didn't want the boys and girls living together without marriage,
Yes.
so we had gone and to the city hall and had a legal ceremony. We heard that's what he wanted, and so Mukunda and Janaki came, and we got married, and then we were initiated, and then after that, a day or two later, then we got Prabhupada performed the wedding ceremony.
That's
And
quite extraordinary. I mean, you see somebody a few months ago who are married, which is so much of a counterculture to the counterculture, and then you went ahead. Also, you were inspired to the extent that you got married to receive uh, the Swami, His Divine
yes,
Grace.
we knew this
Amazing.
was not going to be an ordinary situation.
Well, it clearly seems you were already disciples before becoming disciples in terms of following and adhering to what you felt would please him.
Well, we weren't, I mean, even as far as the vegetarian thing goes,
Hmm.
like it wasn't even clear at that point, not just with us, but even with some of the early disciples and immediately how far that went. Like at the time in America, at least, maybe in Europe, for example, Catholics didn't eat meat on Friday. They ate
Yes.
fish.
Yes.
So we thought, well, eating fish was okay,
Hmm.
but then we found out it wasn't. And then,
Yes.
and then, for example, for some people, they didn't consider chickens or eggs to be meat, like because they thought meat was red meat, right?
Yes.
So then, how I found that out, like a couple of fellows came out from New York,
Hmm.
because before Prabhupada, before Swamiji arrived, they came out, and I remember I invited him to dinner, and I had made this salad that was quite normal for us, like grated carrots mixed with mayonnaise and raisins. And they said, "Well, what is this?" And I told them, and they go, "Oh, we don't eat that." And of course, my little American brain goes, "Well, we do." But then, the explanation came about the eggs. So, going through the
Yes.
check that off, um, because the older devotees were just literally a few minutes, a few hours older than us. They
Yes.
were also
Yes.
going through a learning curve.
Yes,
But
definitely.
the only book that was available, and then when Prabhupada came, we all got our own copies.
Oh,
But Easy Journey to Other Planet, which was barely, was more, more like a strong pamphlet that was available, but we didn't have copies immediately of that.
Right.
you know. And Prabhupada was using a Bhagavad Gita from, I think, this Dr. Mishra or somebody, he was using that Gita for the translating,
Yes.
for the translations. He didn't use the purports, of course.
Mm.
You know. But
So
having somebody
The Gita commentary was actually happening uh, in
as,
front of you, all of you, in
yes,
during
yes,
those times.
yes. Um, this was another aspect where Srila Prabhupada distinguished himself from anyone else. Was, first of all, he was speaking from a level of authority. He wasn't, spinning wheels in his mind, and that was
Mhm.
not happening with other people. They were just coming out with all this mental nonsense.
Mhm.
So that was one thing. And then he wasn't taking personal ownership. He was constantly deferring to Krishna and his spiritual master. And so that was also very, very interesting that, this level of truthfulness and transparency and honesty, and what he spoke was not something different from what he did, which we saw in other people, and that he had these books. Nobody else had anything, just words.
Wow.
So this added to the conviction that here was a person we could trust, and we wanted to trust him.
So in this period, Srila Prabhupada's instructions were getting inscribed into books.
Yes,
You mentioned about easy journey to other planets,
yes.
and what are the other books in the 60s that you felt attracted to or you felt inspired to look at?
You mean books that weren't Prabhupada's books?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, well, the only book, because the now everything is everywhere, but it was very
Yes.
limited. So we were looking at books like the I Ching or the Pet and Book of the Dead, or
Mm.
Paramahansa Yogananda, that type of thing. In fact, I think in the early days, those were the three books everybody had read. Autobiography of a Yogi, that one.
Yes. Mm.
And of course, when you read that book and you don't have any other knowledge, it's kind of impressive.
Mm.
But once you come in contact with the pure devotee who's explaining the reality of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that just
Mm.
became like a children's fairy tale book. Um, yeah. And that he was translating these books. I mean, it
Mm.
just was kind of otherworldly almost.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
In
Actually,
terms of, yes, I'm sorry,
I
please.
just wanted to read a small part of a letter that was from March 22nd of 72 from
Yes.
Prabhupada. And it's one that I think now they have it, but it wasn't part of it. It was because it was the person who it was written to, Hari Griva, had,
Mm.
kept that letter, and then it had somehow gone to his son, who then showed it to a devotee here in New Vrindavan,
Mm.
and this was after his Hari Griva's passage, and then
Mm.
that devotee had it, and then one day, kind of forgot about it, and then one day he came up with it. I was like in the 2000 something. So,
Mm.
but it's such a anyway, I'll read it. I'm glad, this is from Prabhupada. I'm glad to report that I'm now translating nightly, and each day Sam Sundar types the tape and Prajumna is editing the Sanskrit. So we shall be sending more and more material because you say that you can edit any amount that we can supply. So I take that as a challenge, and I shall try to see if you can keep up with me. And he goes, yes, you are correct to say it is all nectar. Everything having relationship with Krishna or Lord Chaitanya is nectarian. And our literatures in our line of Vaishnavacharyas is so nice that there is no comparison anywhere in the world for it. So I want that my disciples like you and others should take this task very seriously to give the world access to this great treasury of Vaishnava literature by producing innumerable books and small booklets that the force of literary influence will change everything and save the people from their miserable condition and corrupt status of life. Srila
Wow.
Prabhupada Ki Jai.
Ki jai. Actually,
I mean,
that letter sort of just captures the contrast that you were previously talking about when you gave that example. It sort of captures in the words of the author, Srila Prabhupada himself.
in this first, if you think about it, I mean, I can tell you at one point what he told us. It's in July of '67, and he was going back to India to recover his health. And I won't go through the whole scenario, but he told us everything I have to teach you is in these books. And these books were that 3 volumes of the first canto, right? And I mean, when you start reading the purports in that first canto, it's like, they were written before it came to America. And it's just as if it's right now. It's like, it's so amazing. And one of the purposes, the preaching of the Bhagavatam principles will automatically render all men austere, clean both inside and out, merciful to the suffering and truthful, merciful to suffering and truthful daily behavior. And then he said, this is the way of correcting the flaws of human society, which are very prominently exhibited at this present moment. That present moment it's like
remains present all the time.
absolutely. It's absolutely incredible. And if that's all you ever read is the first canto, you have read everything Prabhupada has to teach. And he said it.
That's a very important message for us to carry.
Not that we should just read that, stop there, but it puts a value on that,
Indeed.
And when you consider what he's speaking in these purports and how it is so concurrent, and then you realize, wait a minute, he was writing these purports before he came to America. It's amazing. Srila Prabhupada, the word amazing gets a little overused nowadays, but what can you say? He's amazing. He was a pure.
Yeah, for some personalities like Srila Prabhupada, it's apt. For others, it's just being used for the sake of, flattery often. In the 60s, while the literature was coming out, etc., you read this letter from 72, you gave this personal instance from 67. How often would Srila Prabhupada remind all the disciples then to read his books? Because you must be all very busy with so many services. Did you find the time? Did Srila Prabhupada encourage you? Could you share something with us?
He always mentioned that all devotees connected with Krishna consciousness movement must read all the books that have been translated. Now, this is taken from a purport in the CC, but it reflects what we were repeatedly hearing. So he said, read all the books that have been translated, like Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and Bhagavad Gita, and others. Yes. Otherwise, after some time, they will simply eat, sleep, and fall down from their position. So, wow. But then he, not everybody, like David Reed Swami was saying, I was reading 4 and 5 hours a day. You remember that?
Yes.
Incredible.
Yes.
Hridayananda Goswami was telling how he got a book and he was, he went into the temple and they immediately gave him service, right? Mm-hmm. But he wanted to read, so he kept a book in the closet room. Well, there was a closet, the brooms and the cleanup room where you have, and he'd go in there and turn a little flashlight and read, But not everybody had that same thirst, and Prabhupada recognized that. He said sometimes. He even mentioned in a letter that sometimes rich men have no inclination for studying, but still he opens schools for others to study. He says, so like that, all of my students may not be inclined to study, but they're very eager to give others the opportunity to read my books, and this should not be discouraged. So Prabhupada had such a um, broad vision, keeping everybody engaged somehow or other in Krishna's service. And reading the books, yes, we should read and study. He said we should read the books, study the books so that we know them chapter and verse. He said, just like a lawyer. This was in a little conversation of Tamal Krishna, and I think it was Mahabhuti. He actually asked them to make he's trying to say a quote a verse. And they kind of looked at each other, and each one was thinking the other's going to quote the verse, and Prabhupada could detect that neither one of them knew it. So then he said that we had not, it wasn't just reading, you had to study so that you know chapter and verse, just like the lawyer. He studies the law books, he knows them chapter and verse, and that way he can defeat the opponent, So otherwise, how will you preach? How will you convince anybody? And then he said, do you know that even I read my own books? And then they kind of look at each other and he goes, yes, I read my own books because, he said, I did not write these books. So that was really like messing with their minds. He says, when I sit down to write, Krishna comes and dictates to me in my ear, and I am simply writing what Krishna is dictating, what he's telling me. He said, therefore, when I read these books, every time I learn something new.
Well, we learned today from your grace that actually Prabhupada had a very broad vision, and depending upon the individuals that he was dealing with, he may also give a general instruction, but also tell them, like you just quoted this instance of Tamal Krishna Maharaj and Mahabhuti, asking them to memorize, not just read, study, but memorize like a lawyer.
Yes, yes.
You previously mentioned, Your Grace, that Prabhupada mentioned that if we don't read, if we don't study, it would lead to, difficulties.
After some time, this is they meaning us, will simply eat, sleep, and fall down from their position.
Quite a warning, quite a stark warning, and also raises alerts.
And I think 70s, many of us we experienced that. I can say
that was what I was going to ask you without giving names. Could you share? Because a lot of times, busy devotees. I'll start with the managers within ISKCON. The managers are overloaded. If you're good in your service, you just get more and more service.
Yeah, I'm sure you know that.
And something has to give, so they're not able to read. And I want to ask you two specific questions. One is, if you can share from your experience how it really happens, because one argument that devotees present is that, listen, we're still doing devotional service, we are engaging in other activities, so that should give us protection even if we're not reading. So that is my first question, is that how does it really happen when people are still trying to engage themselves in bhakti or service?
Well, first comes the chanting, the hearing, the chanting, Shravana Kirtan. So it means, you got to get your fingers on those beads and chant. And you must also read. And Prabhupada said reading is hearing. Hearing is reading, So if there's some difficulty reading, at least, nowadays we have all these like really nifty devices. You can just stick something in your ear and put the little thing in your pocket. And I can put something on my phone, and as long as I'm in the area, like in my house, I can hear. I don't even have to be, there, because it goes into my hearing aids direct from the phone. So, of course, you have to do it. But in those days, it wasn't always, we didn't have those opportunities, but still the recordings started, tapes, cassettes, they were coming out. And so Prabhupada said, here, hearing, not that we should avoid picking up the books and reading, you know. I mean, now with the ebooks and all that, but there's just nothing like putting your hands on one of Srila Prabhupada's books and turning those pages. And you know, he was so, another thing that he was so astute on, he was a great marketer, actually. All those illustrations, he explained, you know, you're nowadays, not just Western people, nowadays, people are less inclined to sit and read straight, hardcore philosophical literature. So he had the illustrations there to capture the attention and give some indication of what was the spiritual world like, you know,
A
and to illustrate.
transcendental marketeer.
Yeah, and he said, you know, that you've heard the expression, these are windows to the material world. But they also, he said, they brought the Bhagavatam to life because they would illustrate certain verses, particularly with the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. You know, they would have these really graphic illustrations to pair up with a particular verse.
Yes. In fact, I wanted to share the windows to the spiritual world are so powerful that whether you're a small child, literally like my daughter, or anybody else's child, they relish it. And even if you're a toddler in Krishna consciousness, we also sometimes relish it more than the written word. So for both kind of toddlers, it works out quite well to
Yeah.
attract us. In
Well,
terms
one
of the
time,
70, I'm sorry, please.
I was just going to say that one time a man up in Canada he got a book, and you know, like how the devotees would put, it was like, I think it was in a train station, but we saw the picture. So he took the book and he comes home and he throws it in the bedroom of his daughter. He goes, here, this is for you. There's pictures. I guess you like pictures, right?
Mhm.
Well, she read the book, and then that was it for her. So, you know, as soon as she was able to leave home and find the temple, she was a goner.
Mm. That's true. They're so attractive, and
And
one
she's
feels
here,
so.
and now she's here in New Vrindavan. That was Canada. Now she's been in New Vrindavan for like, I don't know how many decades. But it all began with her father. Here, this is for you. You know, the pictures.
Yes. In the 70s, when the so much literature, I mean, Srila Prabhupada was publishing and writing, and it was being published. This may be a bit difficult question, but was there any particular writing or book which you were more attracted to and you liked more than the others in the 70s?
Um, well, not only myself, you know, Sri Sapanishad, because it was a little concise. But obviously, when Krishna book came out, that was a mind blower. It was just like, and it was originally it was in 3 small books in a box, you know, in a like a case.
Yes, yes.
It was called the Krishna book trilogy, and each one had a different picture. The first one was Radha and Krishna, and you know, so they had the different pictures, and of course, because George Harrison had written the, you know, intro, it was like so easy to like sell those books. The pictures were beautiful, they were astounding. And at that point, I was up in Denmark. My base was France, but I was up in Denmark. I had a large party, and we were spending a lot of time there. And we found the people very, you know, very easy to deal with. And should I tell you something?
Please.
a little unusual. So we each had our specialty areas where we would go. Like if you weren't too bold, maybe you would just go door to door in the apartment buildings, because in those days the housewives were still home. Nowadays, good luck. But other people would go in schools or to offices. I was doing factories and sex shops. And there was a lot of sex shops in Denmark. I would go up and I would like say, you know the Kama Sutra? And they would always say, yes. I said, this is better. It's illustrated. And George Harrison endorsed it. Damn, they just like that was it.
Wow, wow, and definitely it would have helped. It would have changed many a lives because these books are so powerful. And in terms of your stay in Europe, when you moved from the US to London and to other parts of Europe,
Well, then from London,
what?
we were sent to India. So
Hmm,
then after India got established, then I came back to England for a while, then Holland, and then a whole bunch of countries and France and
how did you
traveling.
bring these books? I mean, how did the journey of the books happen in that continent? And also
Um,
people taking up the reading,
very
etc. there?
difficult, very difficult. We, we had to in those days to go from one country to the next. There was border, like a custom thing.
Yes.
That wasn't open borders. So our van was tricked out. It was rigged in such a way that there was like a false floor. There was like
Mm,
all kinds of little tricky places to hide things, books
mm,
in, you know. We also had some Krishna conscious records, and that would also be there sometimes.
mm,
But the books, they would, because you would have to pay, it was called the VAT, value added tax.
mm.
And because they were coming from America, they would have been
Yes.
extremely, so we were like under the radar, with
Mm.
the books. Yeah.
Quite challenging. I mean, quite adventurous and challenging at the same time with the books. But you got them to the extent of even taking to those shops in Denmark. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we had them
Wow.
sent over from, I was getting them at that point. Because I was the head of the show, I was getting them from England.
Right.
You know.
It, then those years in the 70s, while you were leading and together you were establishing centers or preaching to people, were you also working on any culture with respect to encouraging devotees to read books yourselves? Because there would be many which will come under your wings, per
Yeah.
se.
Um, there were various way, like at night before you go to bed, Krishna book reading. I mean, I think you've probably heard that from so many people.
Mhm.
That was wonderful. And definitely even in we had Bhagavatam class. I
Mm,
mean, in 1967, after we were initiated, okay, so I were initiated, he goes, go out and preach. And I'm like,
mm,
how do we do that? I mean, and he goes, you listen to what I tell you and then you speak. Don't add or
right.
subtract. Then he was speaking for the Bhagavatam. And then he had us giving class. You can
Mm,
imagine, like, we're, but we did it. And that's
mm,
how we learned. And that's how the taste would develop. Even people who didn't, yeah, I know several devotees, they didn't even know English, but
mm,
by hearing from Prabhupada, hearing from his books, trying to read them before they got into their language, they learned
mm,
English, you
mm.
know, and they also learned about Krishna.
And surely these devotees had a lot of inquisitiveness to know more about Krishna. That's why they went the extra mile to learn the language,
Yeah.
which was just a compliment that came through.
And we didn't, like when I was in Europe, we didn't always have books in the language of the country we were in.
Yes.
So, we would, um, we couldn't speak the language. We get a little mantra in their language, and I just remember like staring people down to just talk to them and take it. But the first book we got in Dutch was the Hare Krishna cookbook,
Right.
and
Right.
so that was another unusual thing. So we still had the same format. We each had our niche. We were going. I was
Mm,
going to slaughterhouses and factories,
mm,
and I'd go in the slaughterhouse, and I'd just say, "Tuck for the Frau, take it for your wife, take it for your wife." I didn't give them any like. I didn't tell them it was vegetarian, obviously. You know,
mm,
and these people, they just because it was such an unusual thing to have a foreign person coming and they're telling you to take a book that they would just do it.
mm. Yes, and with that force and purity too.
Mm.
You mentioned about George Harrison earlier on. May I ask you, Could you share something about how and what inspired him to get interested in Srila Prabhupada's books? He was a musician, and what
Yeah.
role did some of you play in
No,
him building
he
that
had,
relationship?
before we even left the country, there was a LP, long playing record,
Yes.
from a label called, it was called the Happening album. And it was Srila Prabhupada chanting. It was, I mean, you can get, it's so beautiful. People need to listen to Prabhupada chant kirtan. They need to hear what the heart and soul of kirtan from a pure devotee sounds like. Anyways, George got that record and he played it and played it and played it until he wore it out. And then he heard that there was some of those people he'd heard, but he didn't know where we were. And then, of course, the incident came when Shamsundar was able to get an audience with the Beatles because our friends from America, the Grateful Dead people, came over with the Hells Angels and their motorcycles. And Rock, the manager, was a friend of Shamsundar's. They'd gone to school in Switzerland together. And he happened to mention, well, I got to, going to meet the Beatles. And he goes, oh, you mind if I tag along? And he said, yeah, come on. But what was so funny, so there's Shamsundar and, and Devamrit was talking about like wearing the yellow robes, the grihastras. He said the women were in pink. Sorry, they were not wearing pink. They were wearing saffron. And there's photographic evidence of this. There's a whole story how that happened. But anyway, so he's in the, we call the canary yellow period. He's in the canary yellow or the yellow dhoti, head was shaved up. And before we left San Francisco, we had gotten from Gargamuni, who we affectionately called Gargamuni, as did Prabhupada, he had some imported things, and he had these Nehru jackets. It was raw silk, and so there was a black, a red, and a blue one. So Shamsundar had the blue one, and I think Gurudas was red, and Mukunda had the black one, whatever. But he was wearing that, with his dhoti. And they go into this room that's filled with people all sitting there hoping to meet the Beatles. And then a door opens and one goes through, but he didn't look at anybody. Another one goes through, he didn't look at anybody. Third goes through, he didn't look at anybody. And the last one was George. And he's making a beeline to this other door that they all went through. And suddenly he sees Shamsundar. He just stops and says, hey, man, where you guys been? I'm looking for you.
Wow.
And he invited him in that room where they all disappeared. So, it was because we made an effort, because we made a lot of efforts, Krishna reciprocated in a wonderful way for George and Prabhupada's movement.
Did he like to read books? Did George Harrison like to read books?
I don't have any idea if he did, but he wrote, when Prabhupada personally asked him to write that introduction, he was very he happily did that.
Quite a touching one as well.
Yeah.
We all were so inspired to read that introduction.
Even today, it's like, wow, it's so warm and friendly and positive and clear.
And quite personal as well.
Very personal. Yeah.
So that was the 70s. Now 5-6 decades on, what have you seen? 6 decades of experience, Srila Prabhupada's books. Do you see a difference in culture amongst devotees or temple residents in terms of reading, studying Srila Prabhupada's books?
It depends where you are. Like if you're in California at ISV with Vaishesika, you're reading, you're studying. And other places too. But because people don't live in temples anymore, it's not as like in the temple you would, sit down together, you would read together. I mean, Bhagavatam classes, of course, now in many places they're online. In New Vrindavan, they're in person and online. But the attendance isn't what it given the number of people that live there. Although in part that is due to some people are, even though our temple's open, some people are nervous about coming, but it's not with the same excitement, maybe for new people, but at the same time, once people start reading, they start appreciating, and that's a fact. And even older devotees pick up the books after a long hiatus and it's just like fresh all over again and diving in. And I know quite a few devotees who have taken advantage of COVID to get back into reading, the reading slash studying.
Now, many devotees, like you mentioned, are congregation members, community members, householders, working outside, etc., etc. Uh, you've you've lived life, seen life. You've been through the householder period of life as well. And many of us, we would like to ask this question. We struggle. Many devotees struggle in terms of finding time to read. Could you give some
Well,
advice,
the
some
re- the
inspiration?
the reading and chanting, it is a struggle. I don't know if I can pull this up. Anyway, as a householder, when we first went to England, we didn't have a fixed place to live. We didn't have our own zip code. We were tossed here and there. We weren't even always living all together. I had a husband to care for. Plus, I had a 6-week, a small baby, and she was 6 weeks old when we left the country. And so trying to put it all together, reading wasn't on the top of the list. Just trying to get rounds done, just trying to get through the day. And, our mission, we were there unequivocally to get a temple for Prabhupada. And that was like, and still, you've taken this vow, you have to chant, you have to, and it was like really rough. At one point I was living in a garage in a cardboard box with my daughter, seriously. Was so, I wrote to Prabhupada and I asked him, did you find it difficult as a grihasta when you were a householder? Did you find it difficult to practice Krishna consciousness? So that's the question I think you're asking,
Yes,
isn't it?
yes, it is.
So, he wrote back. And actually, you could say that was maybe a little bit of an impudent question in one level. But Prabhupada also knew our hearts. And so he answered me. Other people had asked questions that he didn't think were appropriate, and he let them know. And but he answered me, and he said, "You have asked, did I find it difficult?" He said, "And yes, I did. But why was it difficult for him wasn't the same reason it was difficult for me." He goes, "Because my family, they were not supportive." He said, "Therefore, I was obliged to leave them." Um, and then, I still had, you may know that the story how I found those first small deities of Jagannath. So I had those with me in English. So on the top of, the husband and the kid, and I was the cook for the devotees, which meant I had to do the shopping. I also had these little deities. So I had mentioned something about that. And he told me that that once the household, activities are over, then you could take care of the deities. He says, but the main thing is to chant 16 rounds without fail.
I bow down. I bow down to your austerities. I'm feeling overwhelmed just hearing the number of items you had to take care of, what to say of actually trying to juggle with all of that. And
in I don't remember the purport, but it's in the Gita. We should mold our life in such a way that we never forget Krishna. Well, how is it that we are going to remember Krishna? It's, of course, by the chanting, by the reading, by connecting with Krishna, So these things are like as essential as eating, but sometimes it's just like, um, let's say you're drowning. Oh, I still have my rounds to chant. Well, no, got to get out of the water first, type of thing. And yeah, as managers, I mean, sometimes there's, what do you do? And I was on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada, and he was asking, San Francisco early, so everybody's chanting. I said, well, we're trying, at 16 round, we're trying. And then I said, well, I think we sleep too much. And then I corrected myself. Well, I sleep too much. He goes, well, how long do you sleep? And I said, well, 6, 7 hours. He goes, that's not so much. I said, but you must chant 16 rounds. And so in other words, mold your life in such a way you never, you get this done. But still sometimes it's unfathomable. And then I asked him, so that means if we um, don't have that we have around something that we should forego sleeping? He goes, yes. So we could, and then he explained also wasn't, we had this like the magic number 6. He said, somebody asked him, well, what if you sleep more and you need more? He goes, that's all right. Sleep until you're refreshed. That was it. But you must chant 16, and read the books, of course.
Yes, and it's clear, he was quite unequivocal on that, very clear that this is the priority. When you come across managers and householders, I'm sure it depends upon case to case, um, what encouragement could you give us in terms of the value of reading, the importance of reading Srila Prabhupada's books in our lives?
Don't give up. I'm not a great example of somebody who's, I cannot sit down for 2 hours because he said that you read 1 or 2 hours daily. I can't sit there for 2 hours and read. Partially, I finally realized one of the reasons was that my eyes had become very weak. So I have recently had an operation that removed the cataracts, but even so, the close-up thing, so it's like it's there's that kind of a challenge. But just the general atmosphere, like the 6 Goswamis, they would live under a different tree every night, and they were completely peaceful. I'm telling you, from this COVID situation, I realized one thing. I'm not going back to my crazy life of traveling, all over the place like a mad woman, like coming back for 1 or 2, 3 days max, repack, get out, just. And I think a lot of devotees have told me the same thing. The older devotees, it's like having had this opportunity to slow down in our lives has been a benediction for us.
Yes.
But still the world is crazy out there, and the noise, the sound, and whatever's going on. We don't live in a pristine atmosphere that's conducive for spiritual life.
Yes.
So we have to look for that atmosphere and create that atmosphere. And it's not always, as they say, it's not always easy, but like I joke, like I heard people say it's hard. It's hard. I said, that's not our mantra. It's hard. It's not our mantra. I know devotees in jail, in prison, in harsh situations, and they've had unfortunately they're in that situation by misdeeds, but by Krishna's mercy, by Prabhupada's mercy, by Lord Chaitanya's mercy, they've developed a taste for reading and chanting, and it has preserved their sanity.
And that also sustains us, as you mentioned a few times, that it sustains our spiritual life.
Yes.
In terms of various books that are coming out, I also wanted to ask you, sometimes now we are overwhelmed with the number of books around us. You go into a temple or a bookshop, and there's so
Yeah.
much literature, and it's all nice Vaishnava literature. Um, when we ask this question or about reading Srila Prabhupada's books versus other books which may be, more attractive, maybe easier read, etc., could you please give us some guidance? How should, as devotees, we should prioritize Srila Prabhupada's books vis-a-vis others that are available?
Yeah. I remember one time Raghunath Swami answering that question, and he was telling us for 16 years, I never even looked at another book. I simply read Prabhupada's books. And that gave a deep foundation, you know. So I don't have, I mean, Prabhupada wanted us to write. I just, when I picked up a couple of quotes I wanted to, if it came up, that Prabhupada said that he wanted his students to write articles, small pamphlets, small book, he wanted, because it's, that gives evidence of the process working and a realization, and also by writing, people also sometimes become, they get deeper realization. But if we find ourselves unable or unwilling to read Prabhupada's books, we're not really going to make a lot of progress, because as wonderful and there's some incredible devotees in ISKCON. I mean, when people think that Prabhupada didn't give us everything, read his books. Read these books. I mean, it's just like Chaitanya Charitamrita, my God. What isn't in there? First Canto Bhagavatam, what isn't in there? But we have to become clear about who we're following and who our master is and who our guide is. So these other books, they're all right. And I mean, just recently I gave one to, one of these, what do they call them? Bridge books. Bridge books are excellent, but you got to make sure the person crosses the bridge. So this
That's
lady
right.
now,
Who would want to, colloquially speaking, who would want to live their life on the bridge?
yeah.
That would be fun.
So, and then the thing that I found really disturbing nowadays is the absence of Prabhupada's books, the absence even of the mention of the books, and the absence of the mention of Prabhupada. And in the name of preaching.
That's another topic. Please share something. I mean, if you are noticing that, obviously, I mean, you're noticing that with respect to contrast, because you saw Srila Prabhupada as the founder Acharya yourself.
Yes.
You were with Prabhupada. But may I submit something honestly to you? That
Sure.
some of us who come new and walk into our temples, they'll probably not notice it. So
I
how do
know
you
that.
bring
I
that
understand.
back in?
Um,
So how do you bring that back in?
well, I've fortunately had experience with people that, not even devotees, coming in the temple, seeing Prabhupada in the Murti form, and with folded hands, and then does he ever speak? And I pointed the books. He speaks volumes. But, by speaking about Prabhupada, glorifying Prabhupada, I mean, in a real way, not a superfluous way, or just, running off a bunch of, oh, he's magnanimous, he's this, he's that, but wonderful examples. Even get them to look through. People have told me by reading Lilamrita, then they wanted to know more. And when they got to know more, they realized these books, this is what he gave his life for. Just think about Srila Prabhupada on his deathbed. What was he doing? He was still translating, giving the purports of the 10th canto, 13th chapter. He wasn't even eating anymore toward the end. but he gave his life to us. So the least we can do, just out of gratitude, would be at least, if you want to, look at it like that.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't, what could I say? I wish all of us were so introspective, but definitely after hearing you speak, it encourages us to be introspective and not be superfluous and just using adjectives for Srila Prabhupada, but really develop that appreciation. And I think one clear message that I got from you today, and all of us got from you, Your Grace, was that we'll only be able to realize Srila Prabhupada's personality, his contribution, and a life transforming experience if we pick up the books and we start applying it to our lives. That's where lives will get transformed. If there is any difficulty, you also gave us examples of how Srila Prabhupada kept encouraging devotees, asked them also to prioritize their life in such a way. You said, mold your life,
Mold your
mold your
life in
life,
such a way that you will never forget Krishna, and that means you have to read and chant.
read and
Yeah.
chant. Well, that we will all try with your inspiration now to read more and to bring back our focus on Srila Prabhupada's books, like you said, that
I
sometimes now
get
we don't even see.
something to remember. This is from Nectar of Devotion in the
Yes.
12th chapter. So, a person who is constantly engaged in reading literature, enunciating the cultivation of Vaishnava devotional service, is always glorious in human society, and certainly Lord Krishna becomes pleased with him. A person who very carefully keeps such literature at home and offers respectful obeisances to it becomes freed from all sinful reactions and ultimately becomes worshipful like the demigods. So even, at least Prabhupada said even touch the books, so not to say, okay, I've touched the book today, but make an obeisance. Srila Bhakti Vinod would keep his books very carefully wrapped, and then he would put them on his bookstand and make obeisances. He would carefully unwrap them, make obeisances and pranams before reading. So reverential. And I just see it so kind of casually, people having these beautiful books, like not even being careful. Even the speaker of the Bhagavatam, like tossing the book around and I'm feeling ouch, So cultivate some respect for the books. At least do that much, And if you want to know Prabhupada quoting himself, read my books. One of my god sisters, Denise, asked how, and she was a book reader and a book distributor. She asked, how can I know you better? And he goes, read Krishna book. I mean, it's there. He's telling us. So, but become respectful of the books, respect the devotees,
Yes.
and above all, offer our unlimited obeisances to Srila Prabhupada.
We will definitely try to walk in your footsteps in the way that you're guiding us and leading your life in developing this love and affection, respect for Srila Prabhupada. Uh, we are at the Ministry of Education. We are trying to do these interviews with senior devotees such as yourself.
Which is, I don't see that I'm much help, but I'm so glad when I heard about this project. I was really happy
Would you be kind enough to share with us some other things that you think we could do in this project to encourage devotees to read more, some ideas which will help us to take this forward?
I mean, just off the hand like that. I've already said develop respect for the Bhagavatam or the books in general. Offer obeisances to them.
From a project point of view,
open them up and read them.
Sure.
even if it's just a little, because now we all have our devices, right? So we've got the
Yes.
books. We walk around with the books. So
Yes.
while we're reading everything else, just pick something and read it. Get something, eat something. Nourish yourself a little bit, even if you
Before
can't
we
do the whole thing.
before we leave today, is there any personal anecdote that you would be able to share with us with respect to Srila Prabhupada's books that you had directly with Srila Prabhupada as a parting message or something that could inspire all of us?
I mean, an interaction with Prabhupada regarding the books.
That's right.
Is that what
Yes.
you're asking? I
Yes.
mean, not directly, no.
Mm.
I mean, to be honest, I have to be honest with you.
Yes.
Just the message that he gave to all of us, which I take as a person, he's speaking to us. He may be speaking broadly, but he's speaking to us. I take it personally. And
Yes.
he's telling us, read the books, read my books. He said, I didn't write them for you to sell. You must read them. He said like that also. Um, that our literatures are unique in the world. And we want to introduce our philosophy in learned circles. So keep trying to place my book in auspicious places such as libraries, universities, clubs, and your own homes. I noticed so I was in this house, I was doing this program in Bhagavatam, and then they pointed, oh, I saw the whole Bhagavatam was there. How long have you had it? 3 years. How much you've read? And then I looked, they were still in the plastic, they're how they come wrapped up. I said, what is this you have? I said, you have to open them up and read them. They're not a show, they're not a decoration, even though at least they were there. And when the time comes, hopefully that will happen.
Well, I'm quite confident that many of us or any of us who would actually hear you speak will now be inspired to respect, worship, and now, as you said, open up those, remove the plastic, and read Prabhupada's books and develop appreciation.
In one letter, he wrote that actually these books are the foundation stone of our movement. Whatever we are is resting on these books. So far, reading them and distributing them. This should be our only motto. I mean, it's just over and over and over,
Yes,
you
indeed,
know.
indeed. Well, I really hope that we create this foundation for our personal life and with your
And
inspiration also for the institution.
one other quick I wanted to mention, I
Yes.
wanted to mention it. Um, in a lecture, he mentioned in 69 in LA that all students should be encouraged to write some articles after reading Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Those are the books we
Yes.
had at the time. They should realize the information and then they must present their assimilation in their words. Otherwise, how can they become preachers? But all students should be encouraged to write some article after reading. So
Very inspiring. And I will try, I know that one devotee here in Sridham, Mayapur, Shadbhuj Prabhu, his house I went. I think he
oh,
has the original 3 volume. If I get an opportunity, I'll go there. I'll take that picture and I'll send
oh,
that to you if
thank
I can
you.
find
Thank
it.
you. I was going through because I don't know, I guess it was unfortunate or fortunate, but I gave my edition to a very, very sincere devotee who had fallen on some rough times and was sincerely re-entering. And I just wanted to encourage that person, and I gave them that. So
I'll try my best as a reciprocation. And I'm really thankful. I must mention that it's late in the evening, but still you obliged us by taking this conversation with us
yeah, it's
today, Your
late.
Grace. Thank you so
Krishna,
much. But as a reciprocation, I'll try to procure that if I can.
thank you.
And
Thank you so
with
much.
folded hands and my which I'm really bowing down for all the austerity. And if it wasn't for you, Your Grace, and the devotees, then where would we be and where would we get the opportunity to have Srimad Bhagavatam? So thank you.
And if it
Thank you for your
wasn't, and if it
time.
wasn't, and if it wasn't for his divine grace, really, where would we be?
Yes.
Hare
And all
Krishna.
glories to Srila Prabhupada and Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books. Thank you.
Haribol. Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama,